If you have a yeast infection, avoiding certain foods can help manage and prevent the overgrowth of yeast, Candida, in your body. Here are some foods to avoid. Sugar. Yeast thrives on sugar, so it's crucial to minimize your sugar intake. This includes not only refined sugars but also natural sugars found in fruits and some dairy products. Avoid sugary snacks, desserts, and sweetened beverages. Processed foods. Highly processed foods often contain hidden sugars and can disrupt your body's balance. Avoid processed snacks, sugary cereals, and fast food. Simple carbohydrates. Foods with a high glycemic index, like white bread, white rice, and pasta, can raise blood sugar levels and potentially worsen yeast infections. Opt for whole grains instead. Alcohol. Alcohol can increase the growth of yeast and disrupt your body's natural balance. It's advisable to limit or avoid alcohol while dealing with a yeast infection. Dairy products. Some dairy products, particularly those with high sugar content, may promote yeast growth. Consider reducing your consumption of sweetened yogurt and sugary dairy desserts. Fermented foods. While fermented foods like yogurt and kefir can be healthy, they may contain live bacteria that can worsen a yeast infection in some cases. It's best to limit or avoid these foods temporarily. Caffeine. Caffeine can potentially weaken the immune system, making it harder for your body to fight off yeast overgrowth. Reducing your caffeine intake may be helpful. Mold-containing foods. Certain foods, like aged cheeses, dried fruits, and mushrooms, may contain molds that can contribute to yeast overgrowth. If you are susceptible to yeast infections, consider limiting these foods. High lactose foods. For some individuals, high lactose dairy products like milk can exacerbate yeast infections. Opt for lactose-free alternatives if needed. Artificial sweeteners. Some artificial sweeteners, like aspartame, have been linked to disruptions in gut flora, which can affect yeast balance. While research on this is limited, it may be worth avoiding artificial sweeteners if you have recurrent yeast infections. Most asked questions. What is a yeast infection, and how does it relate to diet? A yeast infection, often caused by Candida overgrowth, is a fungal infection that can affect various parts of the body. Diet plays a role because certain foods can either promote or inhibit yeast growth. Why should I avoid sugar when dealing with a yeast infection? Sugar is a primary source of energy for yeast. Consuming excess sugar can promote yeast overgrowth, making the infection more challenging to control. Can I eat fruits if I have a yeast infection? While fruits are generally healthy, some fruits are higher in natural sugars. It's advisable to limit or avoid fruits like grapes, melons, and overly ripe bananas during a yeast infection. What's wrong with processed foods in the context of a yeast infection? Processed foods often contain added sugars and preservatives, which can contribute to yeast growth. Additionally, they lack the nutrients needed to support the immune system in fighting infections. Can I have dairy products while dealing with a yeast infection? Some dairy products, particularly those with added sugars, can potentially promote yeast growth. Consider reducing your consumption of sweetened yogurts and desserts. Are all fermented foods bad for yeast infections? Fermented foods can be beneficial for gut health, but they may contain live bacteria that can exacerbate yeast infections in some individuals. It's advisable to limit or avoid fermented foods temporarily. Can caffeine worsen a yeast infection? While there is limited evidence, caffeine can potentially weaken the immune system, making it harder for your body to fight off yeast overgrowth. Reducing caffeine intake may be helpful for some. Is it necessary to avoid all carbohydrates during a yeast infection? No, you don't need to eliminate all carbohydrates. Focus on complex carbohydrates found in whole grains and vegetables, which are less likely to promote yeast growth compared to simple carbohydrates. Should I eliminate all dairy products if I suspect lactose intolerance during a yeast infection? Not necessarily. Some individuals with lactose intolerance can still tolerate lactose-free dairy products. Experiment to see which options work best for you. Are there specific foods that can help with yeast infections? While diet alone may not cure a yeast infection, foods like garlic, coconut oil, and probiotics may have antifungal properties and support a healthy balance of gut flora. How long should I follow a restricted diet when dealing with a yeast infection? The duration of dietary restrictions may vary. It's best to consult with a healthcare provider or registered dietitian for guidance on how long to follow a specific diet and when to reintroduce restricted foods. Remember that dietary changes alone may not completely resolve a yeast infection. If you suspect you have a yeast infection, consult with a healthcare provider for proper diagnosis and treatment. They can provide guidance on dietary adjustments and recommend appropriate antifungal medications or treatments to help address the infection effectively.